Sur la côte ouest, je suis certain que c'est pas mal plus chaud. Et c'est la bataille des groundhogs aujourd'hui. Ça fait qu'on espère que les deux vont être du côté qu'on va avoir un printemps tôt. So with this, I'll call the meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 15 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on October 24, 2020, the committee is resuming its study on processing capacity. Alors aussi, pour garantir le bon déroulement de la réunion, j'aimerais vous faire part de certaines règles. Les députés et les témoins peuvent s'exprimer dans la...
So I'd like to give you a few rules before we begin. The interpretation service is available for this meeting. You have a choice. At the lower part of your screen, you can choose either French, English, and with the latest version, you can speak in the language of your choice without having to select the language channel. The raise hand function is now more accessible. If you wish to speak to me or alert the chair, please use it if this option is not working. And I would ask that you just physically raise your hand, and then we will have a speakers list of those who wish to speak. For those participating in person, you will do so as you do. I don't think I have to read it all. We don't have anybody sitting in the room. And the witnesses can speak in the language of their choice, and the interpretation will be provided during the meeting, and you just choose the channel on the bottom. I'm sorry, I already read that. Before speaking, please wait for me to name you, and please activate the participant microphone, and that's controlled by the sound techs here. All observations made by members must be addressed through the chair, and I would please advise you to put yourself on mute when you're not speaking.
Welcome our witness for today for the first panel. We have from Agri-Food Economic System, Dr. Al Mussel, Research Lead. Welcome, Mr. Mussel, Dr. Mussel. And from Agri-Food Innovation Council, we have Monsieur Serge Buis, Chief Executive Officer. So welcome, Mr. Buis. And with that, we'll start with opening statements. We'll start with the Agri-Food Economic System. Dr. Mussel, you have the floor for up to 7.5 minutes. Go ahead, Dr. Mussel.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, honorable members, I'm pleased to appear before you this afternoon and to provide the insights I have to offer as an independent researcher focused on Canadian agriculture and food. As a country, we take great pride in our agri-food system and its performance. Our point of departure is a position of strength, and the flip side of the challenges that I will raise are opportunities for Canada. I would like to begin my remarks with this important acknowledgement. I will touch briefly on a number of immediate and tangible challenges to food processing in Canada. These are the challenges of today, impacting the ability of food processing just to be retained in its current state. There are also forthcoming challenges only just beginning to be conceived. Increasingly, the full range of issues that we face in relation to food processing in Canada will not entail a stable solution in which we fix a problem and the solution endures over time. The environment is more unstable, and maintaining solutions for food processing will require broader ongoing effort. Much of the data published by Statistics Canada dealing with capital stocks and food manufacturing was terminating in 2013. Increasingly, we are left to public announcements made by firms investing in new plants for information. That doesn't provide a consistent or satisfactory source of information on processing investment, infrastructure, and capacity. Scale in food processing in Canada faces a number of constraints. From the perspective of product brands and food marketing, Canada is a small market. Yet from a geographic and product distribution standpoint, Canada is a very large area to serve, and the need for product freshness and, and distribution can require multiple plants operating throughout the country at a relatively small scale. The Canadian market is also fragmented provincially through provincial regulation in farm products marketing under the interpretation of Section 121 of the Constitution Act. In effect, the platform through which many processors purchase farm products for processing is provincial in structure, while their primary customers, grocery retail chains and food service distributors, operate at the national level. The challenges of obtaining and retaining human resources for the needs of the agri-food sector are no doubt well known by this committee. This certainly extends into food processing, where economics would have dictated that food processing plants be located in rural areas near supplies of farm products for processing. Increasingly, plants are locating closer to large urban centers, as accessing the necessary workforce becomes the key consideration. For some years now, the trends and forecasts documented by Employment and Social Development Canada have pointed to trends in education and training oriented towards professional careers. This risks leaving our sector with a gap. A recent and troubling development is the erosion of our global trading institutions and a shift toward bilateralism on behalf of large economies with the economic weight to use trade as leverage. Agri-food products are frequently drawn in as an instrument of retaliation in trade disputes, and the resulting injury drives the demand for agricultural support. For example, the United States has repeated and highly significant ad hoc farm subsidies in place dating from 2018. These support U.S. production, advantaging U.S. food processors. In addition, support also applies to food processing plant development. For example, in a recent announcement, municipal supports exceeding $1 million US were given for development of a poultry processing plant located in Alabama. There are also increasing technical challenges to exporting food. The pandemic has elevated these. For example, exports to China have recently become subject to inspections of packaging in food shipments for the COVID-19 virus. This has resulted in suspensions by China of exporters in a number of countries, including Canada. China has also invited countries to self-delist plants in which there have been cases of COVID-19 among employees. However, the process to get relisted as an exporter to China is not clear. Delisting by China under either mechanism could be an overwhelming blow for a food processor leveraged into export. In the domestic market, food processors face a customer base of retailers and food service distributors that is highly concentrated. This by itself is a concern, as the loss of a single retail account could be disastrous. Moreover, the supply chain relations between suppliers and grocery retailers is increasingly seen as fraught in Canada, with concerns regarding involuntary and arbitrary fees levied by retailers to processors and requirements placed on processors that generally increase uncertainty and inefficiency in the supply chain. This topic occupied considerable discussion at the most recent Federal Provincial Agriculture Ministers Conference. The process of constantly raising the bar on all aspects of food quality and safety and on facilitating innovation is in the interest of all. However, the public process and nature of regulation can undermine this if it is excessively cautious, onerous, or creates uncertainty. Regulations need appropriate analysis, consultation, and resources behind them, and excessive fees for regulatory approval can form a barrier to new product introduction. Carbon taxes are recognized as the most efficient instrument for greenhouse gas mitigation. However, the potential magnitude of these costs on the food system are sobering. Without some rationalization of how these costs will be shared, the concern exists that they will end up being allocated by bargaining leverage in supply chains, with the costs rolling back to the food processing and primary production segments. We are struggling to come to grips with how the economic adversity in Canada fragments itself across the segments of our society. But the effects appear worst in the prairie provinces, whose economies are most closely tied to energy. There is a need to replace employment lost and restore economic growth in these provinces. One avenue for doing so is through agriculture and food, with food processing investment as a linchpin. My hope is that new economic development in Canadian food processing can proceed on the basis of competitiveness and efficiency, but this environment is ripe for dangerous provincial economic rivalry. Some recommendations. Evidence-based policy development requires quality data. Improved collection of public statistics that deal with the capital stock for food processing in Canada with the resources to analyze the data and interpret the results are necessary. Many of the challenges that I have identified boil down to inefficiencies in food supply chains. Understanding the causes, the cost of the inefficiencies, and who is affected can help bring about the resolution and relax barriers to investment in food processing. Through investments in technology research and development, Canada can redouble its efforts to facilitate improvements in efficiency at smaller scales and address some of the issues with workforce in food processing. Ongoing work is required on Canada's approaches to regulation of the food system and the provision of public resources to support regulation that is effective for all. Export market access and also access to imports is fundamentally in the interest of food processors. Canada needs to continue its pressure to restore and expand the rules-based trading system. Equally, Canada should explore approaches to trade and processed food that address its broader priorities: notably climate change and the facilitation of processed foods featuring a reduced carbon footprint with protective border measures based on the carbon footprint of the imports. Indeed, missing this point could lead Canada to falling behind. Investments in food processing can be an important generator of regional economic development and form a portion of the solution for economic recovery. The federal government has a role to play in facilitating recovery through food processing investment, but in a coordinated manner that avoids the pitfalls of provincial rivalry. Recognizing and addressing our constraints in food processing are critical in advancing the goals in the Barton Report, and more fundamentally, having Canadian Agri-Food play the role that it can in economic development, enhancing food security, and being a resilient food supplier to the world.
Thank you, Dr. Mussel. Unfortunately, we have to cut you off, and there'll be a chance to answer some questions. We'll move to the Agri-Food Innovation Council. Monsieur Serge Buis, Chief Executive Officer. Go ahead for up to 7.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan. And good afternoon, and thank you for giving the Agri-Food Innovation Council a chance to provide recommendations as you study processing capacity in Canada. The Agri-Food Innovation Council has been in existence since 1920. It is a unifying voice for research and innovation in our country. Our members include research centers, universities, university faculties, producer groups, government entities, large, medium, and small businesses, all involved in research and innovation on agri-food. Some of our members are located in your ridings, such as in Mr. Steinley's riding of Regina Lewin with Protein Industries Canada and the Farm Credit Corporation, while others have various connections to agri-food research and innovation, such as the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada research centers located in Madame Bessette and Mr. Bloy's ridings. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in Canadians being concerned about food safety and security. For some people, this was the first time in their lives that they went to the grocery store and couldn't find the products that they are used to buying. The problems we are experiencing with processing capacity won't end when the pandemic ends. We require thoughtful action now. The Agri-Food Innovation Council would like to offer tangible recommendations that, in our opinion, are realistic solutions for some of the ongoing problems. We consulted our membership when preparing this presentation and making a recommendation, and we certainly want to thank them for their input. I also want to take the time to thank the farmers, workers in food and beverage manufacturing and processing plants, distributors, retailers, and food services that enabled Canadians to continue to feed their families, even when it meant taking a risk for themselves. Let me move forward with our recommendations. The first recommendation is to ask that the government create a funding program to facilitate the adoption of automation technology for food and beverage manufacturers, as well as processing plants. As noted by Food and Beverage Canada and le Conseil de la Transformation Alimentaire du Québec in previous submissions to this committee, automation in food and manufacturing would help reduce risk for our food systems. Dr. Andrea Brocklebank of the Beef Cattle Research Council, one of our members, also suggested further adoption of automation for repetitive tasks in processing plants. Along with increased efficiencies, this would also reduce risk of worker injury and facilitate a transition of labor to value-added jobs. We see the lack of capital as one of the key barriers to the adoption of new technologies for food and beverage manufacturing. The government has a role to play. Let's take today's news. The government has announced that it has secured a deal to manufacture vaccines in Canada. It is providing funding for new facilities. That is fantastic. It shows that the government sees a role in making us more independent for the supply of vaccines. We need to be able to replicate that type of support for food and beverage manufacturing and processing plants. This will strengthen our food security. The development of a funding program to facilitate the adoption of technology for food manufacturers and processing plants would go a long way to support companies with the large capital investments required. Rightfully so, Canadians view food security as a crucial issue. Increased adoption of automation in food and beverage manufacturing, as well as in the processing plants, would help. Canada is a nation of innovation. However, we have seen an increasing gap between research and commercialization. Incubators and accelerators in agri-food, such as Creative Destruction Labs, Bioenterprise, and the Saskatchewan Food Industry Development Center, can provide early-stage companies with guidance, cross-sectoral connections, mentorship, and access to capital and funding. And this leads me to my next point, incubators. Our second recommendation is that the federal government should incentivize the expansion of incubators and accelerators to stimulate entrepreneurship in agri-food. Incubators play an important role in bringing together agriculture research with other key sectors, as Dr. Paula Uckstroff of Grain Farmers Ontario noted to AIC. This is why they're important, and the government should play a role in supporting them. In November and December, AIC held a series of video conferences on the climate for investment in agri-food research and innovation. We had a number of presentations from Canadian organizations, companies, funders, and even international organizations, which helped provide comparatives for Canada. The agri-food research and innovation sector is underserved in terms of private investment. As Mr. Dave Smarden from Bio Enterprise said during our video conference, trying to help agri-food companies find capital for activities such as piloting demonstrations was currently a significant challenge. This is partially an issue of perception and limited knowledge of available opportunities. As Kelly Fitzpatrick from NutriScience Solutions in Manitoba said that while government funding is generally effective at funding research, more could be done to support agri-food ventures looking to market innovative products and processes. My final two recommendations further my previous comments, that the government collaborate with industry to actively attract private investment in agri-food research and innovation by promoting opportunities, success stories, and incentive for investments, and that the government expand NRC's IRAP offering to SMEs looking to commercialize their innovation by making capital costs eligible. In the not too distant past, December 2017, in a report on Canada's economic growth, Dominic Barton highlighted agriculture as a key growth sector. He was right. There is no question that this pandemic has had a deep impact on all of our society. And stemming from that, we have new challenges for our economy. But we don't need to see solutions to challenges as being out of reach. Yes, we need to move quicker and smarter. Yes, we need to work better together. Our recommendations don't necessarily mean big programs. They can be implemented and will benefit our country. The government, to its credit, has in the past 10 months made more regulatory changes, developed new programs than in the past number of years. When there is a crisis, our society rises to the challenge. In this presentation and in the brief that you should have received, I highlighted 4 recommendations that either require some investments but would support economic growth for the recovery or at little cost for the government. We would be pleased to see this committee adopt all or even some of our recommendations as its own and would also want to work with the government on their implementation. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you.
Mr. Brie, and I had lost Dr. Mussel, so I'm glad to see you're back on the video. Everything's good. So now we'll go to our question round, and for 6 minutes, we'll start with Mr. Epp. Go ahead, Mr. Epp, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me begin by saying thank you for excellent testimony from both of the witnesses. I'm going to begin by directing some questions to Dr. Mussel. Al, it's good to see you again. Your words that we've often shared in conversations. Dave, the market is always right, even when you think it's wrong, ring in my head. And so here we are trying to enhance the market for processing capacity in Canada. You've given us a lot to unpack. So let's start. I had a question prepared around the location specifically of meat slaughtering capacity, the trade-off between economies of scale and nearness to supply or nearness to market. I'm going to expand that because you touched on exactly that, but introduced another factor being labor, access to labor. Mm-hmm. How does access to temporary foreign workers feed into that matrix of economies of scale, of access to market or access to supply, and access to labor? Can you comment further on that?
Yeah, a bit of a complicated topic, Dave, but thank you for the question. You know, based on pure economics, and you look at, you know, his sort of in our midterm history, when you're looking at livestock, it's expensive to transport livestock, so you tend to want to locate livestock processing facilities in areas where you've got production of livestock, as opposed to in big cities. And what we've had over time is, you know, that reality is still there, but you know, if you're going to have a plant that might employ 1,000 people, 1,200 people, employers have to think increasingly where exactly those people are going to come from. And some of the food processing facilities I'm familiar with, mostly in Ontario, I mean, they get very innovative. You know, they'll coordinate transportation for employees to get to plants from urban locations. But you know, increasingly they're locating right in urban locations. You know, even they'll in other words, they'll take on the diseconomies of transporting the livestock, or in this case, or the farm product more generally, to the plant to take advantage of the economies of having the workforce there.
Thank you. I got lots I want to get to. You talked about the need for more independent third-party data so that we can make good decisions. Stats Canyon referenced. What would be a mechanism to get that data? Are you talking about compelling disclosure? How do we find that balance?
Well, I guess maybe what I can say about it is this, Dave. This information was collected previously. Back in 2013 and in around that period, there was quite a number of data sets that were being collected that were agricultural statistics that data collection ended from Statistics Canada. So I think, to be fair, I'd want to leave that to Statistics Canada, ask them how they collected the data previously. You know, one would hope that they continue to do that again.
You mentioned the carbon tax and its cascading effect, or its tendency to be borne by the lower ends of the value chain. Do you have any mechanisms in mind? Are we talking just straight exemptions at the lower end to drive that or share that cost? What would be some policy mechanisms?
Well, you know, to be fair, Dave, I think we need to learn a little bit more about it. You know, there's some worry that with carbon taxes coming, you know, you got food packaging, you've got the production of the farm product itself, you got all the transportation and transformation processes in between. That could be a large burden. But if we look at, as I made reference to, the bargaining relations in our food supply chains, the retail segment has been pretty successful in just basically pushing that back to the processing and farm level. And, you know, to some extent, we have regulated marketing and farm products to deal with issues like that. I worry that the allocation of the carbon tax could follow that same pattern, and it could end up residing with the farmer and the processor, not be distributed equitably.
Thanks. You touched on the retailer concentration or the retailer power. From your independent viewpoint, can you make a quick comment on the code of conduct as a policy mechanism to address that?
You know, it's a real concern. Other countries have taken it on as well. I think perhaps the best way to look at it is an issue of inefficiencies. What types of inefficiencies create some of the demands on behalf of retailers, and what some of the demands on behalf of the retail segment from processors create inefficiencies themselves. And perhaps that should be our best lens to attack it.
If China's not willing to go down a rules-based world trading order, where should Canada focus? Because so many of our sectors are export focused.
You know, I think we've already started the process, Dave, of working with allies to take on actually issues specifically like the COVID-19 swabs on food packaging. So my understanding is that Canada's had discussions with Australia, New Zealand, the US, probably the EU, maybe some others, to kind of have a united front on this, because this is disguised protection, and we can't tolerate it.
Thanks. Let me go to regulation for a bit. You talk about regulatory reform. You know, other witnesses have talked about the two-edged sword, where particularly our food safety, the regulations give us a positive international brand, if we would, and yet there's a cost to regulation borne by industry. When you look at regulations, what's the yardstick? What's the external standard you bring some values around that?
Yeah, it's a tough question to tackle, Dave, you know, because you're really trying to hit a knife edge with regulation. It's not in anybody's interest to have no regulation. That's part of the credibility of the Canadian product.
Thank you, Dr. Muckle. Thank you. Sorry, we're out of time, and we'll move to our next questioner. So, Monsieur Drouin, allez-y pour 6 minutes.
Drouin, you have 6 minutes.
Mr. Mussel and my esteemed constituent, if he still lives out in North Glengarry, Monsieur Brie, it's great to see you. I will get to you, Monsieur Brie. I know you've got some members in Mr. Steinbeck and Madame Bessette's riding, but I have the best CEO up here, so there you go. Mr. Mussel, just in terms of the data that you've you've mentioned the fact that Statistics Canada is no longer keeping track. How are you finding that particular data now? Like, are you relying on industry surveys essentially?
Well, the short answer is the data doesn't exist. What we have, we go back to the survey of manufacturers and logging, which gives us information on the earnings of food processing companies and things like their GDP contribution, some of their major expense items. But in terms of the capital side, the capital stock that we have, depreciation, how we relate productivity back to investment in food processing, we don't have that information anymore.
Okay, and then you've mentioned access to working capital or to HR, and I think that's great that you're mentioning that. And I'd be curious to find out whether you have found, and if you have through your studies in other countries, where they have filled that gap through automation. And then I will ask that same question to Monsieur Brie, but have you found that automation can fulfill an HR gap in some areas for food processing?
Maybe I'll say it this way. In my limited study of it, I'll say one example you can look at is Denmark. Denmark's I think done a very effective job of doing this, but really, and part of that's some of their own technical capability, but also the job here is to take individual positions in a plant that historically have been relatively a low level labor job, and to increase the value of those positions through automation. And if we're going to have more of a professional workforce in Canada, which our trends suggest that we want to be able to attract those people into food processing.
Great, thank you. Monsieur Brie, merci de faire.
Monsieur Brie, thank you for accepting to appear today. I noticed that one of your recommendations was to facilitate a program for automation here in Canada. And so I'm curious to know if your members mentioned obstacles within the industry department. Did you notice any obstacles? Did any of your members speak of this? Thank you for your question, Monsieur Drouin. So yes, our members did tell us that there's a problem here. Often, funding programs require job creation. But when we're talking of automation, we're not necessarily speaking of creating jobs, but rather training workers and having them change position. And this creates a barrier to capital access through funding programs. This problem exists, and there's also the fact that a number of federal programs, as the one I spoke of in my opening statement, that hinders access to funding. You also made another recommendation in your opening statement. You are asking the government to collaborate with the private sector in order to create opportunities, marketing opportunities, and to create incentives to investment. Often the story that we hear here in Canada compared to the United States is that there's a lot more venture capitalists in the United States, and the access to capital is much easier. Do you think that Canada could strategically position itself if it is able to attract those investments? I know that we improved the capital cost allowance to invest in equipment, but what other incentive could we put into place in order to attract private investment? It's obvious that there is a problem here in Canada compared to our neighbors to the south. We have so many examples of research and innovation that was done here in Canada, but once we are at the marketing stage, people go to the US because that's where the money is. And so we have to implement policies that will render us able to do better. So tax policy, targeted policies that the government could implement to reduce obstacles to investment. We had conferences with our members, and we heard multiple examples of measures that could be implemented by the government to attract investment.
Thank you. I think I only have 10 seconds left, so I'll pass. Thank you, Mr. Drouin. Thank you, Mr. Bouy. Mr. Perron, please go ahead. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Bouy, you really gave us a lot of food for thought. You gave us several relevant examples of programs that we could implement. Could you give us some examples? Yes. There are some things that could be developed by the government. There's the problem of taxation. We have seen this to be a problem. This is quite a problem. We have heard that there may be some movement there. There's investment that could be made in research and development, and tax deductions that can be made for research. There's the SHRED program, and this should be reviewed. There's some openings that need to be made in the area of venture capital. This type of investment fund in Canada has been replaced by angel investment. I'm sorry, I don't know what the term is in French, but we would like to see the government pay more attention to this type of investment. We could do this by promoting such investment. Our American neighbors have understood that the agri-food sector is a sector for the future. And further to the Barton report that came out, it was revealed that we have a lot of work to do. When you talked about the U.S., we don't have the same financial means as the Americans have in terms of indirect funding. How can we compensate for this shortcoming? Listen, we don't have the same means as the U.S. does, but we do have some means available to us. And we can take steps. We can't simply stand back and say, oh, they're bigger than we are, so we can't do anything. There are things that we can do to secure our future. We can implement programs that would facilitate investment. There are things that we can do. I've gave you some examples. Even in the report that we submitted to you, these programs don't necessarily have to be costly. Canada, when you look at the natural resources that we have, when you look at the agri-food sector, I think that the government could be called upon to do more. And there are some programs that are very worthwhile looking at. Promoting. Yes, you've got some very good answers. When you talk about research and development, we have heard from academics who have said more than once that the facilities that we have are lacking. Do we not need to be investing in our facilities? Yes. Investments in infrastructure, obviously, and that's what capital investments required, and that has to be done at the university level, but it also has to be done at the company level and at development centers. There are several sectors that should be looked at. And what about tax credits for companies? You mentioned that earlier. Is that not right? The only thing I wanted to say is that in Canada, we often resort to tax credits, but we need direct financing as well. A lot of these companies are going to find it hard to get their hands on capital to go ahead with development. So the government needs to do something. I gave you some examples of what's occurring right today. This applies to the transportation sector as well, and obviously in the agri-food sector. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Mussel, you talk about the imbalance, the market imbalances between the agri-food sector and the retail sector. And you said that the relationship between these two sectors is unhealthy. And if there's no regulation, that can be a problem. But there's going to be a conduct code based on models of countries that have gone ahead with this. What do you think of that?
Elements of industry that are working on a code of conduct, and I'm not sure how that's gonna work. That could be a very positive development. There are a number of, as I mentioned, a number of what I'll call procurement tactics that retailers use that processors simply have to be able to live with, and that comes from an imbalance in market power. But I tend to want to focus this, I think, to be more productive on the matter as an issue of inefficiency.
Thank you, Dr. Mussel. Unfortunately, I got to change questionnaire. So, Mr. McGregor, for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. McGregor. Merci, Monsieur Perron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for your very informative testimony and also the responses you've given to questions so far. Mr. Bouy, maybe I'll start with you. In your brief to our committee, you had made mention of a few of the incubators and accelerators, and one, the Saskatchewan Food Industry Development Center. That's a facility that our committee actually got to have a tour of in the previous parliament, and we those of us who were there were quite impressed with what it was able to do and really help young entrepreneurs bring that idea to fruition. And we actually got to sample some of the products that it made. You made mention in one of your, and you've spoken a lot about what we need to do to attract the investment. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about some of the success stories that we as a committee could make mention of when we're making our recommendations to the government? Can you expand a little bit more on that?
We can certainly provide you a number of success stories for those products and those centers. I don't have success stories at the tip of my fingers here, but I'm.
Can you, in general, is there a common thread that weaves through those success stories that we could briefly allude to in our committee's report? I'm not sure if we've got Mr. Bouy on, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur Bouy, est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Can you hear us, Mr. Bouy?
Monsieur Bouy, est-ce que vous nous entendez? It looks like his screen is frozen. There was a few glitches earlier on with him.
Can we need more investments in rural broadband?
Rural internet, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
That's another study for another day. So maybe we can just pause for a second so that they can check if we can retrieve Mr. Bouy.
The irony is that was one of the recommendations in their brief to our committee.
I think he left the Zoom webinar. Probably he's going to come right back.
He's going to come back. I hate to, so Mr. McGregor, was there questions for our other witness also, or do you want to wait?
Well, sure. Dr. Mussel, did you have any thoughts you could contribute on the question that I was asking Mr. Bouy about success stories? And oh, I see
He's
Mr.
back.
Bouy there. Yeah, sorry.
Est-ce que vous
Mr.
entendez,
Bouygues,
M.
are you able to hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Mr. Drouin's writing, and he's going to have to work on getting us better internet in Alexandria.
The the question I was asking you is, apart from any specific success stories, is there a common thread that weaves through them that you can allude to for our committee to examine when we make our recommendations to the government?
Yes, absolutely. I think the common thread is the fact that a lot of those companies are not having on their own the capacity to do this, and therefore the joining of efforts, the ability to benefit from this incubator type has enabled them to move forward. And you're going to see in the stories that we're going to assemble for you through those three organizations that are mentioned and others, the fact that it is the same story on a regular basis. We are having we are hearing regularly that they need to pool their resources, they need to get some support initially and move forward.
And then, Mr. Bouygues, can you also, I guess for the committee's benefit, just talk about the relationship between local processing capacity and our primary producers, just how important that relationship is. I mean, I know when I talk to farmers in my riding of Couch and Malahide Langford, you know, if they had that ability to add value to their products, maybe it would encourage them to expand their operations. It might encourage more people to get actually into the farming business. If you can expand a little bit more on that for our committee's benefit, that would be great.
Yes, and I think you've touched on an interesting point. There needs to be a little bit more of a link between the farmers, ranchers, and the processing side, and there needs even to be an even better link between the processing side and the value-added side. And we are seeing the same thing where some farmers are looking at processing plants and wanting to get a stake in there, or wanting to better see their products moving and getting some more benefit out of that as well. So there needs to be a better correlation of the effort between the producers and the processing plants, and then the value-added process as well. We've noticed that a number of times in various consultations that we did.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, can I just have a time check?
So about a minute 30 seconds with that.
Okay, thank you.
We cut the time out as much as we could, so should be good.
No worries. And maybe I'll get both of our witnesses to comment. Just you both referred to the fact that we need to engage in this process of automation, and maybe Dr. Mussel, I'll start with you. Just, you know, what can the federal government be doing about encouraging the education of our homegrown talent to help foster that automation? And, you know, what more could we actively be doing in seeking recruits from abroad?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, the difficulty we have is we're short people that want to work in food processing and want to work in agriculture. We have as I said, the trends are more people wanting to pursue professional careers. I think our challenge is to increase the value of people's jobs so that some of those people that are pursuing a professional career want to come and work in agriculture and food and in food processing. And the way you do that is you make the jobs more technically challenging. You change the workplace environment. You make it more amenable to a professional workplace. And I think there's reason to believe that we can do that pretty well. You know, you look at the basis that we have in certainly in parts of the country. So, for example, in Southern Ontario on automotive, there's a lot of engineering expertise there. There's a lot of electronics, AI, et cetera. All these things can be deployed into this area.
If I may.
Thank you. I have to switch questioner now. So thank you, Dr. Mussel. And thank you, Mr. McGregor. Now we'll go with the 5-minute round. Mr. Steinley, 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Steinley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a pleasure to have these two witnesses before us today. And Sturge, thank you very much for mentioning FCC and Pick Protein Industry Canada, which you have right here in Regina. I also grew up near Southwest Saskatchewan and have family that worked at the Canadian Agriculture Research Station in Swift Current. So there's a lot of great things going on. And Dr. Musso, thank you very much for your testimony. My first question is going to be for Serge. What are some of the reasons that Canadian agriculture businesses are and manufacturers are facing liquidity issues? We heard it from a couple of the witnesses, especially from Copel Beef and Jason, about meat processing plants, and the fact that they face a big liquidity issue where you do have to ramp up and have a lot of product on hand, and then when you send that out, sometimes it takes a while to get paid for the products they're delivering if they have to wait for those paychecks, and they're really having an issue bridging that gap. So my question would be, how do we fix that? And secondly, do you know if the counterparts in the United States are facing that same issue?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question. Part of my presentation that I wanted to make today included a note on the whole food system. We're talking about processing today, and I removed it because I didn't want to go through the whole food system. But the fact of the matter is we need to look at the whole food system. And what the whole food system is what Mr. McGregor mentioned, from the producer to the consumer, and the whole, and even waste, and even coming out of the food. So we need to look at that, and we need to look at how things are going. And indeed, what you're seeing, Mr. Steinley, are distributors and their payment methods that are creating a liquidity issue for processing plants. We know that it is partially the same in some cases in the US. There are some other elements as well. There's more capacity for financing as well over there for short-term debt on occasion. So that may be part of the solution. But we know that it is an issue, and the government can look at regulations as well. Is it normal for people to pay 90, 60, 90 days, 6 months on occasion, as we've seen before, for products that they've received? Probably not.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Musso, I'd like to get your opinion on that, and saying, is that something that government needs to directly be involved in with financial or monetary, or is there ways that they can fix regulations and help those businesses attract private investment, so that we could create an atmosphere where we have more private capital coming in, and government wouldn't have to necessarily put the money into the financing, but create a more competitive and attractive atmosphere for these processing facilities?
Well, I think what you're making reference to primarily is working capital. And the reason that you need more working capital is just, in a relatively short period of time, the environment's gotten more risky. And that's the way you deal with that. You just have more cash in the system. Now, there's a few things that we can do here. Some of the risk comes from trade. So it's product that we're exporting that we think we're going to get paid for, that's going to be accepted by the customer, and it's for whatever reason it's not. Government can take action on that to make sure that our trade agreements are complied with, that we don't have frivolous and disguised protectionist actions that are taken against us. That decreases some of the risk. The other aspect, of course, is what we were discussing a moment ago, which is retail relations. And I think you made there, maybe it was Mr. Buie said, if it's taking 90 days for people to pay, or they pay when they want to because they can get away with it because of the leverage they have in the supply chain, that's incorrect, and that needs to be corrected. And government can use some of its influence to do that.
Thank you very much. And this is going to be quick, but Mr. Buie, could you give a couple examples? I'd be very sad if I couldn't pick a couple examples of how the protein industry Canada has had a few successes in 30 seconds or less here in Regina.
30 seconds to go through all the examples with PIC would be not enough. I think you've heard from PIC, the committee, not long ago, and I don't want to be accused of being their cheerleader, but they have done a great job, and they keep doing a great job. So I am a fan. They certainly have done well. I think the main issue, Mr. Steinley, is what's next for PIC, and we think the quickest the government can talk about the future and the future funding for an organization such as PIC, and expand the program to other.
Thank you, Mr. Buie,
as well.
Yeah. Merci, Mr. Buie. Thank you, Mr. Buie. Thank you, Mr. Steinley. And now, Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both witnesses for being here. This is extremely informative, and I very much appreciate it. Dr. Mussel, I would start talking to you because, well, I'm down the road. You're in Guelph. I'm in Kitchener-Conestoga. So, Monsieur Bouy mentioned that a lot of the success stories are often supported businesses, and Mr. McGregor rightly brought up the idea that young entrepreneurs should be an important part. Now, you also talked about that we're short labor, and yet whether it's Guelph or in my in Waterloo region, there's 2 universities and a community college that also has a program for capacity for processing capacity. There's such a skilled labor force that's in there. Can you expand on when you talked about how we can make jobs more technically challenging, or how we can support our young entrepreneurs and the next generation of processing workers and agricultural sector workers?
Sure. So just real quickly, we have a capability around artificial intelligence, automotive engineering, mechanical engineering, other chemistry, other aspects of excellence. I don't think that we've particularly been effective in deploying that at thinking about how we turn, a $20 an hour job into a position that perhaps could pay $70,000 or $80,000 a year and really be a professional occupation for somebody. And I'm not sure that that's an issue of turning out people with undergraduate educations from universities as much as it is, it could be a community college thing, or it's more of a, it's almost a sub-engineering field, and I think that's very important.
And it could also be that these are the people that are designing the software, designing the programs
Yes.
that could very well do that. I read it's very interesting reading in your mandate. You talked about making processing more competitive, more sustainable, and more profitable. And so many times that we hear words like that, sustainable versus profitable, we hear them as diametrically opposed. But you're saying you're working with companies and you can make them competitive, you can make them profitable while still being sustainable. So can you tell me some of the ways that you can help strike that balance, that we can use that in our processing?
I think it kind of builds on your last question. One of the things that Canada brings to the table, and it's the natural resource base that we have. It's a sustainable resource base. It's resilient. It's highly regarded internationally, and of course, it's totally out of scope relative to the domestic population of people we have to feed. And that makes Canadian agri-food, I think, a fundamentally attractive proposition. So I don't agree with the idea that we have to somehow trade off sustainability with profitability. I think the two support each other, and we want to foster that.
Well, that's okay. Thank you. I would like to also speak to Monsieur Bouy. You mentioned that Canada is we have small market with large geography, and you also mentioned that we're fragmented provincially. So can you talk a little bit about the interprovincial trade barriers that are created by these regulations and how that can affect, we've heard that from time to time from witnesses, how that can affect transportation and the processing as well?
Well, on the internal trade barriers, I mean, this is well known. There are major issues that Canada needs to deal with. The agreement on internal trade was the first step, but it is frustrating for people not to be able to move products as easily as they should. The transportation is an issue in the country. I mean, the grain having to travel across the country, et cetera, and various elements that get in there. Is also a problem. I think in terms of internal trade, we are facing challenges, but Canada and the federal government has a key role to try to work on the leadership and work with the provinces. I mentioned the incubators, and I mentioned the creation of more support for incubators. I also don't think we need an incubator for everything in every province, and that's a key issue in our country, where one province has something and we absolutely have to have it in. If I look at the examples in France and Germany, on occasion, they have one development center for one product nationally. In here, in Canada, we often have to have 10 plus in 3 territories, which means that we have 10 weak ones.
Merci, M. Bouy. Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Et maintenant, M. Perron, allez-y pour 2 minutes et demie. Allez-y.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Muscle.
Mr. Muscle, you mentioned the need for the government to act. What could the government do, in addition to a code of conduct, to help the market better regulate itself?
Est-ce qu'on a parlé de M. Bouy de nouveau?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
C'est Monsieur Muscle.
Question. One of the things that we can do is if we map our supply chains better and really develop an understanding of where the bottlenecks are in them, where the inefficiencies are, I'm pretty confident that people can work together, maybe with some support from government and in some cases some regulatory authority used by government in whatever means to work those inefficiencies out. And some of these, I believe, are manifest by demands that that retail customers put on.
Merci.
Thank you. You mentioned the carbon tax and your concern of seeing the cost of the carbon tax or other mechanisms being absorbed by producers and not by other levels. Is there anything we can do? As you also mentioned the need to protect borders and to calculate the carbon tax, I do think that it's a promising aspect, and I would like to hear you about that.
Yeah, the worry on the carbon tax, of course, is if it's shared based the same way that bargaining relations are in supply chains feeding into retail, then this will just get pushed back, and the processor will bear some, and then they will try and take it from the producer, and then ultimately it all rests with the producer, and that's not a situation that we should be comfortable with. So we're going to have to find a way to equitably share those costs. So the first thing is going to be to map the costs out and understand where they are, and then come to arrangements that they're shared equitably. With regard to border taxes, my thinking has changed on this quite significantly. With regard to carbon, Canada has something to offer. Agriculture can be a big solution to some of our carbon challenges. But if we take on additional costs to meet that mandate, then we need border taxes that are going to protect us so we're not undercut from imports.
Thank you, Mr. Muscle and Dr. Muscle. And now, Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bouy, I've got 2 questions for you. I think you were cut off before you were going to respond to my earlier one. It was just on the training aspect with regards to automation. Was there anything you wanted to add? And you're just on mute.
I am. Thank you. Sorry. I think we have several programs in universities and community colleges on automation that are doing a great job on this. I think we have to look at the success stories and move forward. But one of the key things is also putting entrepreneurship in our training. One of the problems that we're seeing is people are having great ideas, great projects, and they're not able to bring them to fruition because they lack the knowledge. We need to do a little bit better on this.
Great. And then my second question is, when you look at the motion that's guiding our study, we want to basically, our primary objective in this study is to ensure the stability and renewal of the value chain. But one of the other parts of our study refers to our goal of also supporting the goal of increasing local capacity to protect food security. And you had made mention of that in your opening statement. Anything you can add to cover that particular aspect of our committee study?
Absolutely. 2 of the recommendations deal specifically with this, increasing access to capital for local processing plants and manufacturing plants. We need to look at the local aspect of this. The businesses don't have the funding to support their activities on that front. The major international companies do. They can make the investment. The small and medium-sized enterprises don't. The government needs to support them on that, and the government also should be able and should want to promote the investments in those facilities. So those are two things that I think could help on this. The NRC IRAP as well, which mainly deal with small and medium-sized businesses. The recommendation to enable capital funding for within that program should be able to help as well.
Great. Thank you so much, and that'll be it for me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. And this brings to an end our first hour. I would really want to thank our panel. Dr. I'm not sure if it's Mussel or Musil. I've heard it pronounced different ways. Hopefully I didn't break it up too bad. But and also Mr. Serge Buis, Chief Executive Officer at Agri-Food Innovation. Thank you both for being here. And on that, we shall break for a few minutes just to change the panel. And we'll be right back. Don't go too far, folks. We'll be right back with the second panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
welcome to our second panel.
For our second panel this afternoon from the Beef Farmers of Ontario, Mr. Ron Lispet, President, and also Mr. Richard Horn, Executive Director. Welcome, Mr. Lispet and Mr. Horn. And also from the Dairy Processors Association of Canada, Michael Barrett, Chair, and also Mathieu Frigon, President. Welcome both Mr. Barrett and Mr. Frigon. Now you can, we'll start with the Beef Farmers of Ontario. You have 7.5 minutes between the two of you. You can share however you like, so you can start anytime.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Lipset, and I'm a beef producer from Grey County, Ontario, and the president of the Beef Farmers of Ontario. Joining me today is BFO's Executive Director, Richard Horn. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. While the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the focus on processing capacity, the beef sector across Eastern Canada has had to contend with capacity challenges for some time due to a variety of factors that have led to periodic supply bottlenecks, significant negative pressure on farm gate prices, and lost market opportunities. Over the last 5 years, federally inspected processing utilization in Eastern Canada increased from 71% in 2015 to 100% in 2020. In addition, Ontario provincial processing numbers are up approximately 20% over 2019 and the 5-year averages. Some beef farmers must wait 4 to 6 months, in many cases up to 1 year in advance, to have their cattle processed at provincial facilities. CanFax estimates that shortages in beef processing capacity equated to $129 million in lost revenue in 2020 for farmers in Eastern Canada. To enhance processing capacity, we recommend 4 key areas of focus: strategic investment in the sector, addressing labor shortages, addressing regulatory differences between Canada and the US, and creating permanent tools to help mitigate processing disruptions. First and foremost, continued government investment in the sector is needed. We need to simplify programming and ensure funding windows have enough runway to allow facilities sufficient time to plan and execute. Focus programs on outcomes and stop limiting what and how businesses can invest in capacity growth. Funding priorities should be placed on projects with the greatest ability to expand production capacity. A combination of cost share funding, no interest, and non-repayable loans should be offered to assist with capital investments to spur production and improve efficiencies. Between 2008 and 2017, Canada's agricultural exports grew 3 times faster than the Canadian average. Last year, Canadian beef exports grew 17%, and opportunity for further growth remains. The sector's ability to maintain jobs through COVID-19 makes agriculture a priority for economic recovery. To capitalize on export opportunities, we recommend creating an industry export development fund to assist export diversification efforts and address trade barriers. For example, the fund could enable processors to apply for matching funding that would support enhanced capabilities to segregate eligible product, support modifications to food safety interventions to meet country-specific requirements, or make other strategic investments that spur growth and improve efficiencies. Access to labor is another issue of concern. A study was done by Food Processing Skills Canada indicating that the meat sector had a job vacancy rate of about 13%, compared to other food companies that average 2 to 4%. In Ontario, this equates to approximately 2,400 vacant positions and $1.2 billion in lost productivity. A domestic strategy to attract, train, and retain the workers by providing investments and supports in training and education is needed. A refocus of foreign worker programs into permanent programs is also needed. The Agri-Food labor pilot was a good first step, but we need to be doing more. There are dozens of countries with ample supply of workers willing to come here and fill the jobs. Pathways need to be created to facilitate this. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Horn to complete our presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Another issue that we wanted to touch on today that is contributing to processing capacity challenges stems from an ongoing trade issue with South Korea, which is having a negative impact on American packer interest in Canadian cattle. South Korea requires shipments of beef from Canada be halted if there's another case of BSE that's found in Canada. Because the U.S. does not have this requirement, processors in the United States that would otherwise compete for our cattle here in Canada are hesitant to do so, as they must segregate those animals and then process them during dedicated shifts. This is a cost that most U.S. plants are not willing to incur. Canadian lawmakers need to push for a resolution with South Korea to have this requirement removed. While our preference is always to have Canadian cattle processed domestically, the issue with South Korea has reduced the availability of processing space and competition for our cattle. We also need immediate revisions to Canada's specified risk material removal requirements, also known as SRM. It's a relic from the BSE days. Canada's requirements have created a significant unlevel playing field between us and the Americans and our producers and processors that is no longer supported by science. The current cost discrepancy between the two countries is significant. On average, Canadian processors remove about 58 kilos of SRM on animals over 30 months of age, whereas the US removes approximately 900 grams. Canadian Meat Council estimates this costs our sector over $30 million a year in lost value, and there's also other associated costs on other classes of animals that we market here at home. Meat that is lost in the removal of the spinal column in those over 30-month animals in Canada can be harvested in the United States, though, and then sold back to consumers in Canada, which adds to the disparity and lack of fairness between the two systems on top of the costs. While we're pleased to see that discussions with CFIA to address this disparity have begun, the goal needs to be fully align our rules, our SRM rules, with the US as soon as possible. This will have immediate benefits to the Canadian sector. Lastly, I want to emphasize the need for continued access to set-aside programs similar to the ones that were implemented this year under the Agri-Recovery Framework in response to COVID-19. These programs help farmers manage supply bottlenecks caused by processing disruptions. If we need this tool again, we need to make sure that it can be quickly accessed this year. When the Guelph Cargill facility closed over Christmas, for example, due to COVID-19 challenges, we were able to quickly trigger that program, which was great to see. This type of program should become a permanent tool to help mitigate disasters and reduce processing availability. Things like floods, fires, human or animal disease outbreaks, and labor force stoppages could be better managed if we had access to this tool on a more permanent basis. That concludes our recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Horn, and right on time. And now from the Dairy Processors Association, up to 7.5 minutes. You can split your time if you wish. Go ahead for 7.5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation today to discuss dairy processors' views on our country's food processing capacity. I'm the board chair of the Dairy Processors Association of Canada, as well as president and CEO of Gailey Foods Cooperative. With me today is Matthew Frigon, president and CEO of the Dairy Processors Association of Canada. Dairy processing is the second largest food processing industry in Canada. It contributes more than $18 billion annually to the country's GDP, supports the milk production of over 10,000 Canadian dairy farms, and employs almost 25,000 Canadians in 471 facilities across this country. For dairy processors, there are two key areas where improvements could support renewal of Canada's dairy processing industry to restore investments and spur growth. The first is addressing the impacts of dairy market access granted under CETA, CPTPP, and CUSMA through the development of a dairy processor compensation program. The second is addressing the unfair treatment of suppliers by Canada's largest grocery retailers through the creation of a grocery code of conduct. As we have previously discussed with the committee, the dairy market access granted by the trade treaties like CETA, CPTPP, and CUSMA has created a climate of uncertainty which has disincentivized investment and innovation in Canada's dairy processing capacity. At full implementation, access granted under these agreements will represent about 10% of the Canadian market, or about $300 million in annual losses to net margin. This is the equivalent to Canada losing 15 to 20 medium-sized cheesemakers. CUSMA will, in addition, restrict our exports of certain dairy ingredients, and since the conclusion of CETA negotiations in 2013, dairy processing is actually the only food processing industry exhibiting negative GDP growth among the top 10 food processing industries on which data is collected by Statistics Canada, and trade agreements have a lot to do with that. The Canadian government has made repeated promises of full and fair compensation for supply managed sectors. Last week, significant compensation for dairy farmers began to roll out. Our industry is still waiting for any sign of the government's intention to announce compensation to dairy processors for their losses. Supporting production at the farm, but not taking action to support processing capacity, is a failure to acknowledge that supply management is a system. Its long-term viability requires both its farming and processing industries to be healthy and growing. A dairy processor compensation program is necessary to ensure that we continue investing in our future in the face of growing imports and Canadian-made products customers want and that are available in the future. A compensation program including tools like non-repayable contributions for investments and refundable tax credits could improve competitiveness and support investments in processing capacity and modernization. Compensation to processors should be viewed as not simply a support or a handout, but an investment in domestic processing capacity, Canadian jobs, and economic growth. I'll now turn it over to Mathieu.
Thank you, Michael. Les pratiques déloyales des plus grands détaillants.
The unfair practices. This is another major obstacle which prevents our dairy processors and also the whole food value chain from reaching its full potential. The recent announcements made by the big retailers about new costs for suppliers have attracted a lot of attention, and that's part of a bigger problem that's gone on for a long time. This will erode the capacity of food processing in Canada. We feel that the expenditures, the deductions, and the administrative costs will simply make the price of retail goods increase by 2, and this is what we call the marketing costs, and they are much higher in Canada than they are in the United States. For example, there the marketing costs represent about 18% of the processors' cost, but in Canada, this is about 28%. This situation is a major obstacle for expansion and growth, particularly for SMEs. The money spent, the money given to the big food retailers in terms of penalties and arbitrary deductions is money that is not reinvested in facilities, innovations, and the creation of new jobs. And in the long term, this might have serious repercussions on domestic food production in Canada. As other people have already said, everything is possible because of the concentration in the retail market here in Canada. The 5 big ones control more than 80% of the grocery market. In comparison, the biggest food processor controls only 3% of the volume. As a country, if we really want to seriously improve local production and make our agri-food system more resilient, and this has become particularly clear as a result of the pandemic, our food value chain must be rebalanced in order to give a chance to food suppliers. We think that this is where a code of conduct for retailers is going to be important. Have you completed your presentation?
Okay, so a code could encourage greater accountability and transparency in the retailer-supplier relationship and create balance and competitive growth retail environment necessary to support growth along the food chain. And we thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett, Mr. Frigon. And now we'll move to our question round, and we'll start off with 6 minutes. Ms. Rood, 6 minutes now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. I'm going to start with you folks from the beef industry here. I'm concerned personally about how this pandemic has affected the producers in my own riding and the processing capacity for these beef producers. It's my understanding that when there are delays for moving cattle for processing into beef, they can translate into unexpected costs of feed, but also it can lead to problems in the internal supply chain of cattle operations. So I'm just wondering if you could further talk about the financial impact to your stakeholders and how those delays affect their profit margins.
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. I wasn't sure if Rob was going to start, but I can start there. Appreciate the question. Yes, delays in getting animals processed creates significant costs to producers in the form of discounts at processors for overweight cattle. Obviously, the costs in feeding an animal for longer periods of time also has huge implications in the hundreds of dollars per head. Every day that animal is delayed to getting to market. So it is significant, and there's little backstop that producers have to absorb those costs or mitigate those costs.
Thank you for that, Mr. Horn. I've also heard that some cattle operations in Ontario have had to ship their cattle as far away as Alberta for processing because of a lack of processing capacity in Ontario that's been made worse by the pandemic. And as I understand that there's about 90% of beef processing market is controlled by two entities, and you kind of touched on that. So do you see any short to longer term solutions coming on stream in the near future to help mitigate the problem that we face here in Ontario?
Well, I think I thank you for that question as well. I think some of that was we touched on in our presentation. Investment by the federal and provincial governments and private industry is huge into making sure that processors that are here and are operating have the tools that they need to expand operations, improve efficiencies, and put plans together for growth, both domestically and to take advantage of the huge market potential on the export front. I think more work needs to be done for small and medium-sized players to increase their capacity locally and at a provincial level and federal level. I'd welcome Rob to add anything in there, but I think some of the regulatory things that we mentioned, SRM removal, issue with South Korea is very important as well to open up processing access south of the border. That will also be critical in helping to address this problem.
I think I might add that what we saw when the federal plants had a backlog of cattle in the processing sector was our provincial plants really stepped up to the plate to try to alleviate some of that backlog. And our numbers for 2020 showed that they had increased their capacity by close to 25%, but they've now hit the wall. And they've been asking questions about how could they access funding for infrastructure expansion, access to labor, and access to technology. So I think all of those combine to make both short-term and long-term solutions to our processing backlog. So I think if we could sit down and find a way to create some kind of funding or labor immigration plans, work to permanent residency kind of pathway, it should help alleviate some of the stress that we feel at the farm level.
So is there any solutions coming on stream anytime soon in Ontario, or is that still kind of a work in progress?
During the last CAP program that was announced just before the new year, it was a shared programming between yourselves and the federal government and our provincial government, and I believe it was a $4 million program. We saw that money snapped up very quickly by all the processors in Ontario. So that was positive, that they want to access the kind of funding that they can do more. So we need to see more plans like that they could ramp up production fairly quickly.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barrett, I just wanted to touch and ask you, you mentioned you were talking about the grocery retail giants fees and fines and special charges that affect your stakeholders in particular. So, and I know you touched on this, but I just want to verify if I'm right in thinking that dairy processors purchasing milk products, you're purchasing at a supply managed price from producers.
That's correct. We are purchasing milk at a supply management, so a set price based upon the end use of the milk product that you use. So we don't squeeze processors. I know I heard producers, pardon me, I heard that mentioned in the last panel. The retailers squeeze us as the processor.
So if dairy producers purchase milk product at a supply managed price, am I right in thinking then when grocery retailers impose a new fee or a fine or a special charge, it goes directly against the processor's profit margin, and that you have no way of passing on those fees or fines or special charges to those who you sell it to?
Well, there is an irony. There's an irony because yes, we don't have the ability to charge it back because the very people that are levying the fees against us are the ones that we go to for a price increase. So
Thank
there
you,
is a
Mr. Barrett.
misnomer.
Thank
you, Mr. Barrett. Thank you, Ms. Rood. Et maintenant, Madame Bessette, pour 6 minutes. Allez-y.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming here today. My questions is for the Dairy Processors Association of Canada. According to a recent report on Agri-Food, we know that there's not enough research and innovation that would lead us to growth in the processing industry and to make it more competitive internationally. In your opinion, what measures are required in the long term to encourage innovation and technical progress in this sector? I'll answer first, and then I'll let my colleague complete the answer. Yes, we're very well aware of this report, but we were not consulted. But the first stage was the compensation program mentioned in our presentation. We want a program that's going to enable the process to position itself in the long term in order to achieve growth. I think this is mandatory, and the pressure put to bear by the retailers and the international trade agreements, well, this is putting a lot of stress on our sector, and these programs are absolutely required, and I do believe that this type of program will enable us to attract more investment in innovation.
I couldn't add any more than that to say that innovation and investment go hand in hand, and there is a requirement to be able to have both. Recognizing that we have a small population, I heard that in the last panel as well, that certainly the ability to be able to innovate and to be able to seek markets elsewhere is a critical component of growth, and that modernization fund is a critical part of that, as Matthew has outlined.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Quelle importance accordez
What's the importance of automation in innovation and growth in your respective sectors?
Certainly, automation is I'll start and then I'll pass it off to my fellow beef farmers but certainly automation is a critical component. Labor, as I heard in the last panel, becomes a significant hurdle for us to be able to go forward. As mentioned, the food industry, although it has experienced some roller coaster hills and valleys through the pandemic, has been able to meet the requirements of the Canadian industry and the Canadian consumers. However, automation is a critical component because manpower and the ability to be able to attract individuals, whether it's a skilled labor or even general labor, becomes much, much more difficult. And I would suggest that even during this pandemic, that a lot of the food processors are looking for individuals and having difficulty being able to acquire the help that's needed to continue to grow and support business.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would just add from a beef perspective, I mean, the processors can tell you what they need. We would underscore what Rob mentioned in his presentation is make the funding programs targeted enough with sufficient runway that the businesses decide how to best implement technology and automation advances in their plants that help spur innovation and growth. That would be our primary recommendation on that.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Still concerning the dairy producers of Canada, we know that transformation is experiencing a recruitment problem and workforce retention, especially in specialized fields. What would be your suggestions and what solutions could the government create?
Well, I would certainly agree that specialized fields are critical. And I think that what we need is in certain areas that we need the ability to be able to have programs that would support. Like, for example, I'm not the largest dairy processor, but I could probably hire anywhere between 15 and 20 apprentice mechanics of all shapes and sorts, whether they're PLC or electrician. We need a countrywide program that allows us to be able to fund that. But it goes beyond that. It also goes to the element of those skill sets like cheesemakers and things like that, that there isn't necessarily the infrastructure to be able to support that type of skill development, and we're having to import it. In the other part of my life, I serve as a school board trustee, and I'm always continuing advocating to be able to understand that there are many, many different options and co-op programs, support of those co-op programs, and the belief that there is another alternative to be able to have a degree, but to be able to support the training of and the encouragement of youth in those programs are essential for the dairy processors of Canada.
Thank you very much. That's good. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Bessette.
Thank you, Ms. Bessette. We will now move on to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I will start with dairy food transformers. When you mentioned compensation, you said that promises were made to you and you had nothing so far. And this for 10% of the market. Did you negotiate amounts with the government? Was there any headway made or nothing?
Oui, on a eu des discussions, mais ça...
We've had discussions, some quite a long time ago, including with the minister. I would say that those discussions, that we've not had discussions over the past few months concerning compensation. I would like you to explain to me what's the negative effect on the sector, because we are studying how to increase transformation capacity. So I have the impression that it's the opposite situation in your sector. This creates a lot of uncertainty. You mentioned 10%, but there's also an impact on the remaining 90% of the market, because we found with CETA is that imports have had an impact on the whole of the price structure in the market, which affected margins everywhere in the market, not just the 10% that was targeted by the agreement. So it is a comprehensive impact. We mentioned it in our introduction. Since 2013, we've been the food producing sector that has performed the worst. We've also experienced negative GDP growth. In 2013, that's the year when CETA was announced, and the situation has worsened ever since. The figures show it very clearly. People are not happy of the situation. Are you concerned about being left aside or forgotten? There are a number of commitments, but we're still waiting for them to be acted upon. producers have had two announcements, one at the end of the summer of 2019 and one right before Christmas this year. We were hoping to get some concrete commitments from the government, but we've been waiting in vain. Am I wrong in saying that the fact that for you to be compensated as promised, this would help us achieve the goal of our study, which is to help you flourish, because that's what you've been asking for? Support for innovation. Yes, exactly. I will let my colleague Michael answer your question.
The concept of the support of the compensation is so that we can reinvest and reinvent our industry to be able to face a new market reality with restricted exports on products that have been an important growth element. Being able to reinvent ourselves is an important criteria on being able to balance this industry out. You can't continue to be able to support producers without understanding that you need somewhere to process it. And again, we don't oppose any producer compensation. I'm a co-op. We do not oppose that. However, we are looking for some equity because the modernization of our industry has to be able to take place, and the reinvention of our industry has to take place, as we have to be able to adjust to a new market and global reality of where we can compete and where we can't anymore, based upon the trade restrictions that are now imposed under the trade agreements.
Merci, Monsieur Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I would like you to talk about the code of conduct for the food and agri-food industry in the face of the concentration of retailers. You mentioned a number of recommendations. Should the working committee not be able to establish a code of conduct, what would be the impact for your industry?
Michael, I'll let you.
Okay, well, certainly there is an initiative going forward on a number of associations that are getting together. There is a committee co-chaired by the Minister of Agriculture that is also going forward with that. But I can only put it into context of the recent Walmart and Loblaws, where there was a unilateral ask for 1.25%. Now, this is the dairy industry, this is the food industry where margins are tight. And so therefore, the incredible impact that will have, and this isn't the first ask. Our members will talk about multiple asks that have occurred over the last decade. I've been in this industry for 20 years. It is just a series of asks. What that would allow us to do is to have predictability in when you make an investment. You can make an investment today, and like the earlier question, you can have a restriction on the pricing that you're going to be able to get. And you're going to get squeezed between the producers, again, which we support, and the retailers.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Merci, Monsieur Perron. And now Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr.
McGregor. Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for providing this testimony to our committee. It's sincerely appreciated. Mr. Barrett and Mr. Frégon, maybe I'll start with you. You know, if you wanted to maybe just take a little bit more time to expand on why this code of conduct is important. I know that, you know, the 7 minutes you have in your opening statement can run out pretty quickly. So is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
I'll start and then I'll let my Mathieu finish. Is that, so first of all, what I'd like to be able to say is, and I didn't get to all the comments, and I appreciate that very much, is that we're not asking for something that has not been established in other countries. The UK, Australia, Norway, as I mentioned in the brief that was submitted, they also have working codes of conduct that are voluntary. And indeed, if you read the UK report, the yearly report that the auditor puts out, it is actually serving both consumers, retailers, and processors well. Because actually what they've seen is a net increase, a net decrease in food pricing within the marketplace. What it will allow us to do as a processor is not get sidelined or tripped up by an arbitrary decision. And I want to put into context. So if one of our retailers decide that they need a new warehouse computer system, they have levied those costs against us. They have levied their costs against modernization of their stores, of the redesign of their stores. Where do processors go to be able to recover that? We cannot go right back to the individuals that are levying that. It has created such an uncertainty that the concept of being able to invest for innovation is grinding to a halt, and we need processing in Canada to support our producers. And I'll turn it over to, oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, you know, when I put my consumer hat on and you're walking through the grocery store, you don't really realize what it takes for a dairy product or any product to be in that high visibility area and the hidden costs. And you know, when I was going through the website of the Competition Bureau and they're talking about their section about market dominance and when does that become an abuse of dominance. Now you talked about the big five controlling 80% of the retail market here in Canada. And I started looking at, you know, what quantifies as abusive dominance. Now you're not directly in competition with the retailers, but the punitive fines that they're levying and constantly asking for more. You know, you talked a little bit about the role the federal government can play vis-a-vis the provinces. I mean, is there anything more that we as a committee can be pushing the federal government to do?
We recognize that the responsibility for such a code of conduct is certainly rests with the provinces. We understand that. We do appreciate that there is a federal initiative, a joint committee it's going forward. But whereas there may not be the legislative ability to be able to intervene, there is a moral obligation. And I think that that's perhaps where the encouragement on that could possibly come from, in the desire to be able to support an equal playing field, to ensure that there's competition and consumers are served in this country. And perhaps that is where we can play that, the federal government can play that role, because it is about consumers. It's about that ability to choose equally and equitably when you walk down the aisle. And it's not about how many dollars are cast into pockets to be able to determine what goes on a shelf and what doesn't. We all have to compete. We understand that. We're prepared for that. We just want equity in the competition.
Great. And did Mr. Fregon, did you have anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, when we look at the UK experience, it's quite interesting because back in 2013, when their own competition bureau made a report, the code, and that was the report that led to the implementation of a code. That report talked about protecting consumers, because that report said ultimately lower investment, lower innovation among food processors, consumers will bear the cost of that, and that was the main justification of the implementation of a UK code. And it's interesting because that UK code is subject to a statutory review every 3 years. The latest was published last year. And no stakeholders, from farmers to consumers, are complaining about the code now. And it's unheard of, I would say, almost. You know, like you have a government piece of regulations where basically all stakeholders are like, we like it. So I think that presents an opportunity, definitely, for Canada to protect both consumers and the entire enhance the entire food value chain.
And I imagine if this is allowed to continue, I mean, it's going to be quite detrimental to our country's food security when you have smaller processors that are getting squeezed out of offering their unique dairy products in a popular vendor and retail space. I appreciate both of you contributing to our study. That about wraps up my time. So over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. And now we'll go to the 5-minute round. Alors, Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Lehoux, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here this afternoon. I have a question for Mr. Bart or Mr. Frigon regarding the agreements that were signed in the past. You've spoken of 2 already in the minister's letter, in her mandate letter. She said that she made some progress in order to obtain certain compensations, but with CETA, we haven't received any information. No, so nothing more tangible was proposed. We did see the mandate letter, but beyond words, there are no concrete actions that have been taken. And so you spoke of compensation. You said earlier that you don't necessarily want a check, but when we talk of automation and replacing equipment that processors use, did you contact the minister on this topic? Did you speak about this? I'll let Michael answer this question.
Laid out our concepts and our concerns on multiple occasions on being able to ask about the compensation and try and propose a framework, probably just as recently as last week at the CDC meeting, where we again posed the question as well. So there have been conversation. We have been assured that it is a priority, but we are looking for fulfillment of that priority since 2015.
Effectivement, depuis 2015.
Yes, so you've been waiting since 2015, so 6 years already that these agreements were signed. No compensation was offered, and the impact of increased market access has been felt for a number of years already. We know that modernization has an impact on certain non-fat solids, or rather solids non-fat. So there's been a significant increase in quantity. So what would you say about that?
Our system is between fat, as you have noticed, mentioned, and the solids non-fat. There is a requirement in this country to be able to make sure that we balance the two, or else that will potentially mean restriction in our ability to be able to continue to grow. Those plants and the replacement of those plants and the aging assets is certainly one of those areas that we would believe that's the possibility of being able to use some of those compensation dollars to be able to rebuild and revitalize, on being able to create plants that also have greater flexibility and innovation, understanding that we have to build those facilities within a trade agreement that restricts our traditional export markets. So therefore, that innovation dollar is critical. To be fair, there was DPIF funding that came out of CETA, and I have to be fair, it was a small amount. It was given to us. It was quickly subscribed, and there was a lot of processors that did not get the opportunity to have that.
I have a question regarding labor. So we've spoken of automation, but you will still need staff. You'll still need labor. There's an important labor issue in the processing sector. And what of foreign workers and the 10% requirement?
For the dairy processing, that's not typically a program that our members would necessarily use. They're all, in the dairy processing. I know there's many other segments that utilize that as a methodology. Maybe my compatriots in the beef industry might be able to answer that better, but it's not something that's typically used within our sector.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Alors, merci, Monsieur Lehoux. Now, Mr. Blois for...
Thank you, Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Blois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses.
I'll start with dairy processors. Of course, we're talking about compensation in relation to the trade deal with Europe and the Pacific Partnership. My question is, would you be committed as part of that compensation to having some tie to the amount of supply managed dairy production in each of the provinces, i.e. if there was 500 million on the table, it somewhat resembles where the actual quota is being produced by the producers that are sending to the processors?
Yeah, I was going to let Matthew start on that one.
Okay. Yeah, what we see, Michael, just talk about the CETA program. What the government typically does is that it strives to have this equal sharing, if we want. Like so, to basically the government always make sure that the amounts is shared in an equitable manner, like throughout Canada. So,
because certainly, typical. Yeah, in my area of Nova Scotia, we've seen Saputo and Agri-Food buy Scottsburn and Farmers Dairy. There's been closures in plants in St. John's, Sydney, and others. And certainly, I guess I'll put on the record, and I hope it's part of your conversations with the government, is that when we're looking at compensation, we're trying to solidify and improve not only just facilities where they're becoming centralized in other parts of the country, but indeed in those areas that still remain in more of the regional economy. That's part of our study as well. So can I ask about TRQs? Because I hear you in terms of the importance of the processing compensation. As I understand it, the tariff rate quotas are also given to processors or some of your membership where the actual price of the input cost for your products that are being processed is lower than perhaps what the average price is for the supply managed products in Canada. That's in some form a way of compensation. Is that helping, or is that certainly recognized within the industry as some form of support, although it's not quite exactly what you're asking for here today?
It does help in some respect, but there's also a balance to that as well, depending upon the use of those TRQs. There are restrictions on how they can be used, and also we have to put that into context on the demand in Canada for Canadian dairy product. I mean, you cannot label a product that comes in from the U.S. as a Canadian or the Blue Cow program. So there are some potential restrictions, and it primarily can help those larger processors that potentially have businesses on both sides of the border where they can utilize, say, two sets of assets. It is seen as some compensation, but the reality is it has not. The amount of those imports have not significantly swayed the cost disadvantage or advantage depending on the market.
And my final point, because I do want to go to the beef farmers, is around tax credits. I don't have a full list of them here, but certainly I know the government has, in terms of amortization on the cost of capital, expediting that, accelerating that, allowing businesses to count that as part of their business write-offs. Is that something that your membership has used or seen as helpful in the day, certainly since the last parliament, where I believe some of these measures were introduced?
Michael, I would perhaps let you
comment. I thought that was being addressed to the beef farmers. I'm sorry. Did I mistake that?
It was for you, but I have about a minute 15, so okay. I better go to them. Perhaps you can address that in your next point, if allowed. But quickly to the beef farmers. Of course, we've talked about foreign labor and access to temporary foreign workers. Certainly, I think everyone on this committee recognizes the importance of what that represents. I'll play devil's advocate for a minute. Is opening up and allowing even more access to temporary foreign workers, perhaps just putting a Band-Aid on what is needed, which is more innovation, as we find it, this has been a persisting problem for decades now in terms of labor in this sector. Is that just kind of pulling us back or being an ankle weight to actually making those innovation changes that are needed?
It's an excellent question. I think it's a balanced approach. I mean, we're going to need labor regardless of how much automation or improvements, plant improvements are made. So the temporary part is the issue that we have a problem with. We want permanent residents that are going to plant roots here and develop careers within the industry. But Rob touched on more of a grassroots campaign through education and training and post-secondary institutions, not just around meat cutting, but in food processing in general. So we'd like to see, I mean, it's really a combination approach of tech and innovations one side, but labor is going to be here and in much needed demand for years. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horn. Thank you, Mr. Blois. Et maintenant, Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes.
Mr. Perron, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to speak to the beef farmers of Ontario now. Thank you for being here. Earlier, you mentioned that you need to review certain norms. Some said that they liked the geographic distinction. So would you like this standard, the SRM standard, to disappear?
On the SRM issue, we need to harmonize with the United States. The costs are prohibitive. They're creating a lack of an unlevel playing field between Canada and the U.S. The science does not support the continued policies that we maintain in this country, and we have started down that path. So I put faith in CFIA, and I hope that they get that done quickly because the costs are significant.
Dans ce contexte-là,
in this context, traceability is quite important. Do you have a hard time with traceability? With this very concentrated slaughter, can you trace your products efficiently?
Yes, Canada has a national identification program, and all tags are retired. Identification tags are retired at slaughter. There's also registration at birth. So between CFIA and industry, we can do a pretty good job at tracing back or tracing forward in the event that we have to. More work needs to be done in terms of movements in between, and we're working on that.
OK, je vais terminer avec 2 questions, en fait, là, si on a le temps.
I'll end with 2 questions. First question's regarding the slaughter capacity. You mentioned you needed an increase in the slaughter capacity, so do you think that small and medium abattoirs could resolve this issue? And what could we do to move that forward?
That's excellent. Thank you. We touched on the investment for plants.
Bonne question. Il faut que ce soit ciblé. Et ça doit être fait de façon stratégique.
Yes, investment, small, medium, and large size plants are part of this equation. And that starts with investment by government direct to them with sufficient runway and without limitation in terms of what can be achieved or what is allowed under growth projects. So
thank you, Mr. Horn.
Apologize for that.
No problem. So, merci, Mr. Perron. Mr. McGregor for 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Perron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrett, the motion that's guiding our study, it's tasking our committee to look at how we ensure stability in our processing sector and how we support the goal of increasing our capacity. Now, your organization represents many different businesses that are of varying size, and you've gone over the impediments, whether it's the compensation delays, the concentration in the retail market. If you're a small scale producer right now, or if you're an entrepreneur who's looking to get into dairy processing, can you just talk a little bit more, like with how the local landscape's looking for them? If we're trying to increase opportunities for these people to get started, what's it looking like if you put yourself in their shoes right now?
Well, certainly, and certainly appreciate that DPAC represents varying different sizes of establishments. And also we have a very good working relationship with the provincial organizations, which even take it down to the next level as well. So those entrepreneurial individuals, and being able to, there is on-farm processing that's taking place. It's being supported. There is small organizations, but it's very, very difficult to be able to work into a mainstream, to be able to grow. It's great to be able to grow locally, and then they have to take the next step. And that's when you do start to run into some of the bigger issues of being able to listing fees. If you get too large, then the infrastructure has to get larger. The trucking pieces, the ability to truck, access the market, the access to labor, equipment is exorbitant. It's not made in Canada. It's from Europe. It's from the US. They're at the mercy of being able to try and make sure that they have adequate supply. Because you need plant supply quota in order to be able to enter the marketplace. Being innovative and niche market has certainly helped, but there is an element that you have to be able to take to the next level. And so those organizations that are between 30 and 100 million, they are suffering, they're struggling with the same elements as the large ones, because once you get to that element, then there's a whole different host of criteria that you have to be able to meet as well, that they struggle with, and being played off against one supplier against another.
All right, thank you so much. I think that concludes it for me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett and Mr. McGregor. Effectively, this is all the time we have. I really want to thank our panel today from the Beef Farmers of Ontario, Mr. Ron Lisbeth, and also Mr. Richard Horn. Thanks for being here with us. And from the Dairy Processors Association of Canada, Michael Barrett and Mathieu Frigon. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on our study. And to the rest of the panel, thanks for being here, and we shall see you next Thursday. So this concludes our meeting call.